Alrighty, well, let's get started. Good afternoon and welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrew Daphne, and I'm the Instruction and Outreach Librarian at the New Jersey State Library. And it is my pleasure to present today Lawrence and Joni Jones, who are going to be talking about what happens and some of the concerns associated with children with autism when parents divorce. Again, kids with special needs are not immune from a lot of the things out of their control that happen in other families as well. So it is an important topic, and hopefully we can all get some clarity on some things today. So a brief introduction. Lawrence Jones recently retired in 2017 as a New Jersey Superior Court judge. During his years on the bench, Jones served as the president of the New Jersey Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges and authored over 60 opinions on novel issues of law. He previously served on both the New Jersey Council of Developmental Disabilities and the Governor's Adults with Autism Task Force, both times as an appointee of Governor Corzine. He is also one of the 5 original founders of Parents of Autistic Children, also known as POAC, having helped launch and then develop this well-known nonprofit organization in 2000. Joni Jones is a registered nurse, board certified in psychiatric and mental health nursing, who retired from the New Jersey Board of Nursing and served the public under 2 separate governors of Corzine and Christie. She also served on Governor Murphy's transition team on health-related issues. In 2013, Joni was the recipient of the Elizabeth Kellogg's Award for Excellence in Nursing. Joni is one of the original founders of Parents of Autistic Children and has presented before the Autism Society of America and the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts on autism-related issues. She is also a former certified developmental diabetes or disabilities nurse. So what a resume for both of you, and thank you for joining us today. A few housekeeping items before we jump in to a fantastic program. First and foremost, we will be taking your questions today throughout the program, so please feel free to ask them using the Q&A button at any time, or you can type them in the chat, and we'll be happy to answer them. There will be a survey that'll be provided at the end of this webinar, as well as in a follow-up email. If you could please complete that, we greatly appreciate your feedback, and it really does help us as we develop our future programming. There will be a handout that will be shared in the chat momentarily, so be on the lookout for that. If for some reason you can't get it, don't worry. A follow-up email will be sent to everybody that will include that as an attachment. So if you're looking for more information about autism, Lawrence and Joni recommended visiting the Autism New Jersey webpage at www.autismnj.org, as they are a fantastic statewide organization and really deal with all things related to autism in the state of New Jersey. One more thing before we start is just a quick preview of the Zoom webinar dashboard that you should be seeing. Just to go over a quick tutorial, if you're having problems or anything with your audio, you can check your audio settings in the bottom left-hand corner. There's a chat button here that'll open up the chat dialog, so please feel free to use that. If you have any problems, you can raise your hand and I will try to address those or get in contact with you. And as I mentioned before, there is the Q&A button here. You can click on that, submit your question. We'll review it and then hopefully be able to answer all of them throughout the program today. So now that that is done, why don't we stop sharing my screen and we'll try some polls just to kind of get an idea of who's in the audience today. So please feel free to select one of these. All right, so it looks like a vast majority of you are professionals in some capacity, so teachers, medical professionals. So that is great. All right, we have two more polls just to kind of help them get an understanding of what they need to do. So this one, how would you rate your knowledge of autism spectrum disorder? All right. So looks like, a fair amount of people have some good understanding. So, and the last one is, all right, just to get an idea of your age to see maybe how long you've been dealing with this. So, all right, and there you go. So, all right. Well, we can stop with the polls now, and I'll let Lawrence and Joni take it away.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Andrew, and the New Jersey State Library for inviting us to speak here today, and thank you for everyone in attendance. This is Autism Awareness Month, now becoming Autism Acceptance Month. It's really a great time to focus on issues relating to the autism community. It was the more knowledge people have in areas concerning autism, the more not only awareness there can be, but acceptance there can be, and progress really for the entire community. So thank you for having us, John.
Yeah, I also want to thank everybody for coming to this because it is a very important topic.
So I looked at the poll, and it seems like those in attendance seem to have a good understanding of what autism is. Autism is essentially a neurodevelopmental disorder of the brain. It affects behavior, affects socialization, social skills, speech, communication, gross and fine motor skills. As I'm sure most of you know, there's no definitive cause or definitive cure, but there have been major advancements, particularly over the last 2 decades, in improving the chances for a child with autism to become mainstream, to become independent later in life, and to be successful. Improving chances for adaptability and mainstreaming. In an intact family, one that does not involve autism and divorce, what would tend to happen, or what could logically happen, is both parents would be on the same page, hopefully relative to what needs to be done for the child, in conjunction with behavioral therapists and other autism professionals, to try to have an educational program and just a general welfare program to maximize the chances that the child will improve and be successful later in life, and hopefully be independent. Autism being a spectrum disorder, there are different levels of autism. There's severe autism, where there are going to be obviously more challenges, and then there's perhaps someone who has more mild traits of autism, what used to be called Asperger's syndrome, and also called high functioning autism. So what happens is, when you have a divorce going on, a separation or divorce, there are going to be extra challenges in many of these cases, because even in an intact family, logically there are going to be challenges concerning a special needs child, any special needs child. You layer on top of that the natural challenges that arise in many divorces because the parents are in conflict with each other. They're not on the same page with each other. There's a backstory as to why they're getting divorced in the first place, which may have caused some difficulties in each party being able to trust each other or otherwise. And it becomes, obviously, in many cases, more complex to resolve and to get everyone on the same page. So in the context of divorce or separation, because some parents were never married, so there wouldn't be a divorce, but they may still be separated. They have a child with autism. It's going to go one of two ways for the most part. They're going through the court system. Number one, if it goes all the way to a trial, then a judge will have to decide issues which may affect the child significantly, issues concerning custody, issues concerning child support, issues concerning parenting time, maybe even issues concerning the therapies a child may have if there's conflict between the parents over that. However, there's a very strong public policy in New Jersey to favoring settlement of litigation, particularly family court litigation, particularly cases involving children. And so what the first thing to keep in mind is that given that policy, many people going through a divorce first attempt to resolve their differences through what's called alternate dispute resolution, also known as mediation. There are other forms of dispute resolution as well, but the most common, arguably, is mediation. And in mediation, two parties sit down with a mediator and attempt to consensually resolve their differences in a way which does not involve a judge making the decision for them. And this has some tremendous advantages. The obvious advantages are, among others, are you tend to save money, you tend to save time, you have control and input into the outcome instead of just hoping the court's going to see things your way. Remember, you go in front of a judge who doesn't know a lot about autism, and there are autism-related issues, it could be even more difficult to have your view completely understood and embraced and perhaps accepted by a court. That could happen, it might not happen, it depends. When you're mediating, you're not depending on a court to decide anything for you. You're trying to reach a resolution usually through open-mindedness and flexibility and compromise. It's also confidential, meaning if you don't settle your case in mediation, the court is not allowed to know what either side may have said or offered or counteroffered in mediation generally. And also with mediation, it's generally, in order for an agreement to be binding, it would have to be usually in writing. Or in a consensually made tape, not in a secret tape recording or anything like that. Until it's in writing and signed by both parties, it's just simply negotiation. So many cases settle in a mediation, and people are able to discuss some of these issues which take place when a child has autism spectrum disorder and the parties are divorcing. So some of those issues relate to essentially right out of the box, such as, for example, whether a child even has autism or not. Joni?
Yeah, and like you said, right out of the box, you might have somebody saying that they have been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and some might be saying, no, that's not true. And there's very specific reasons for this. For example, there's still stigma that's associated with autism. So there may be a particular party that doesn't even want to admit that the diagnosis exists because there's a stigma associated with poor outcomes. There's also an underdiagnosis that we see quite frequently. For example, if somebody has level 1 in the autism spectrum disorder, like Larry said, formerly known as Asperger's syndrome or higher functioning autism, you might see attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. That's one of the most prevalent underdiagnoses that we see. If you have a child that is at least the age of 4, you might see oppositional defiance disorder. And you might also see a speech delay. So there's not even an agreement on the full-blown diagnosis, which becomes very important. And that's not just for the access to services. We don't want to go in the area of labeling a child, but it's very important to know in developing a plan of care. Like Larry, said, and most of everybody here knows that in a spectrum disorder, you can have a varying degree of traits. Some can have more traits than others and more intensity than others. So somebody who's on a level 3 of the spectrum and may not be verbal at all and might have a lot of repetitive behaviors and are isolating, they may require more services. So it's important to be in an agreement on what the specific traits and challenges are, because that's what's really going to mold a lot of the issues that are going to come about in divorce or mediation settlements.
So in the context of a divorce, there could be issues concerning a diagnosis. And so if one parent feels that there's not autism and the other feels that there is, it's quite common for there to be an agreement to get a diagnosis, to have an evaluation done, whether it's done through insurance, whether it's done through the school district, whether it's done through private pay. These methods are explored, and then an evaluation can be done. If a child comes back and does not have autism, it doesn't mean they don't have other issues. They may have other issues, other types of developmental disorders or delays, as the case may be. If it is autism, separate from the issue concerning the divorce is obviously the need to start services the desire in most cases to start services, so that the intense early intervention, which is so helpful to so many children in maximizing their potential later in life, can get started. If there's a dispute between the parents as to what type of intervention should take place, in the context of mediation, they could potentially address and resolve that with the assistance of a mediator, or if they cannot resolve it, if it goes to court, a judge may have to make a determination on that, either by taking testimony from either side and or appointing what's known as a guardian ad litem for the child, or other professionals. That can be very time consuming and expensive. So to the extent that parents can reach an agreement in mediation or otherwise, concerning what the intervention plan is going to be, speaking with therapists and speaking with BCPAs, whatever, that obviously it should be at least considered. But in general, the issues concerning diagnosis intervention, they in some degree are going to relate to a huge issue in a divorce or separation, which is going to be custody of the child. So in New Jersey, there are two types of custody. There's residential custody and there's legal custody, and they're different. Residential custody means who does the child primarily reside with. Legal custody means who makes the major decisions on behalf of the child. Now in New Jersey, there is a very, very strong public policy supporting joint legal custody, meaning regardless of who the child lives with more than the other, regardless of who's the primary residential custodian, or sometimes you have shared residential custody when parents essentially have a 50-50 time sharing or something close to that. Legal custody, joint legal custody, means that regardless of the parenting time, both parents should be able to participate in the major decisions in the children's lives, major medical, educational, social decisions, etc. So given that joint legal custody is preferred as a matter of public policy, not in every case, you could have a case where there's been child abuse or domestic violence, things like that, in which case perhaps it should be sole custody. But given the general concept of looking to achieve joint legal custody is more than just a title. Joint legal custody means you have to be able to actually communicate and cooperate with the other side to functionally reach decisions, which sometimes is difficult for people going through a divorce or who have been through a tough divorce or a bad marriage for that matter. So the issue of custody is something which is going to have to be addressed. And in the context of autism, if there are major disputes right out of the box between parents concerning what the diagnosis, concerning the therapy, concerning anything that's going to take place with the child, it's going to need to be addressed. And if it's not addressed consensually, a court is going to have to decide it with testimony is what would happen. It would be a hearing, like a custody hearing. Now, many times people can agree on joint legal custody. They can agree on a parenting schedule of some type. But even when you're trying to put together a parenting schedule, it may relate in some degree to the intervention and, of course, the therapies which may take place and the timing. So, Joni, how does the plan for intervention relate to this?
Yeah, it's really important to be in agreement in some type of plan of care, because that intensity and consistency is very important. And I just want to address very briefly the plasticity of the brain, because the neuroplasticity of the brain is the ability of the brain to change through learning. And most of brain development actually takes place before a child even enters kindergarten. However, the ability to change takes place to the day that we die, but the rate of change goes down as we age. And that's why it's very important that we get early diagnoses. And many times we run into challenges, especially when we see the higher level functioning autism or level 1, where somebody may present, very bright. They may be able to use their rote memorization. Some people think in pictures, they have that photographic memory. They may be able to read at the age of 2, or they can tell you square roots, not have any idea of how they got there. And they may think they have a genius on their hands. So they might say, no, they're very, very brilliant. They don't need any services. And what becomes very important is that this is also, not something that we're talking about in their intellectual abilities, but in those social deprivations that as they age, the demands are going to get even greater and greater. So we see people that fall through the cracks and then we've lost all this time. So it's very important that we address that. Now, some people might say, hey, you know what? They have professionals, or they have school districts that they get their services with, so we don't need to do anything more than that. And I like to use an analogy of a well. So if a child had fallen in a well and you want to get that child out of the well, you can throw down a rope and you can start pulling that child out of the well. But you can slack, pull, slack. When are you ever going to get that child out of the well? You're simply not. Well, with autism, we're dealing with in the world and out of the world, and we want them to reach their potential. So if they're with professionals and they are with the schools and they're engaged, they're out of their world. But if they come home and there's no follow through, then we're looking at things where they're out of their world and then in their world, out of their world, in their world, in their world. So then we're not getting them functioning in the real world and reaching those potentials while we're trying to get this as early as possible. So we need to have that, that plan of care. And also that's going to set what are the issues. So is this an individual that's going to go to college? Because then there's going to be issues related to college. Is this going to be issues where somebody is going to be in a group home setting? As parents age out, or as an individual gets older, and especially if they're on the level 3 and they get to be very big and they're still very behavioral, group homes are a great alternate solution. However, it's recommended that parents put their children on these waiting lists very early, because there is a long wait list. And if the name comes up and you're not ready for a group home, you just say, no, I'm not ready for it. So if you are, you don't have to sit there and wait years to come up for that opportunity. Is the individual going to need job coaching? Is the individual going to need additional program services? Is it a young child? Is it somebody that can have evaluations done through early intervention where they don't need the referral? Or are they school age? And if they're school age and they're getting the evaluations, if they don't agree with it, then they can have the advantage of being handed a list to choose who they would like to have independent evaluations by. So the comparison of those evaluations will help come to some type of agreement of at least what are the issues or what are the challenges. When we look at insurance issues, some of the insurance companies cover programs and some of them cover interventions and any support services like occupational therapy. So the insurance issues become very important. Some people, money is not an issue and they'll get these evaluations through private pay. But there might be some issues also, according to what the degree of concerns are, is their guardianship needs. And when we talk about people that don't get along in the IEP development, are both parties going to be present? Is one going to be present and the other one being reviewing it that's not present? So they both have some type of say in it. So there's so many different issues that can be generated by that.
Yeah, and it's also really important. A lot of people, when they're getting divorced, there's sometimes almost an automatic movement towards, by one parent or the other, sometimes both, to talk about something such as a 50-50 parenting schedule. And that, even in a case involving a neurotypical child, a child without autism, that can work in a lot of cases. It can work fine if the parents kind of get along, they have similar schedules, they live relatively close together, they're able to get the child back and forth without having the child in a car for 2 hours at a time. That might work well in some cases. And in other cases, it could be a complete disaster. So everything is on a case-by-case basis. But with a child with autism, let's take a hypothetical case where you have, for example, let's say you had a 4-year-old child was diagnosed with autism a year or two earlier. It's just kind of, just getting started in their educational journey. And their parents getting divorced. So now what's happening? Well, one household is becoming two. So right off the bat, we know that with children with autism, They tend to have difficulty sometimes, not every child, but sometimes with things like transition. They do better when there is a consistency to schedules, a consistency to the expectations, etc. You start breaking things up all over the place, it can cause further hurdles for the child. On the other hand, there's a benefit to expanding a child beyond one environment because you want to increase generalization and get the child used to other environments besides just one classroom or one home, because in the real world, there are multiple environments. You want to get the child ready for that. Some appropriate gradual exposure to different environments can be a positive thing if it's done correctly. If it's done incorrectly, it could be a detriment. So when you have two parents who suddenly are separated, now one household has become two, and each side saying, I want the child, and it's got to be 50-50 time. If there's no plan in place, if there's no transition, no structure, no looking at this from the child's standpoint, there can be obviously problems and further burdens put upon the child. If, for example, there are two completely different schedules in the two homes, two completely different sets of expectations, if the child is undergoing therapy, let's say behavioral therapy in school or privately, and there's completely different demands being put upon them, essentially through parental supervision in one household versus another. Now that consistency that's so important in the development of the child, educationally and otherwise, can be sacrificed to the child's detriment. There could be stagnation, there could be regression, there could be, at the very least, less improvement than you might otherwise see if everyone is on the same page. So if you're taking a schedule and saying it's going to be 50-50, well, first of all, how does that relate to the child's therapy schedule? If there's an after-school therapy schedule taking place, and let's say there's a home therapist coming in, and it's Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and now the child's got to go to another parent's home 30 miles away, and it's going to affect that therapy, that's a concern. Now, how can that, in this day and age, how can that at least be addressed? Well, maybe the schedule could be at least temporarily molded around the therapy schedule. Maybe the parent can participate in the therapy, so there's training by both parents through Zoom or in person if the parties are able to be in the same room or have that kind of relationship. Not everyone going through a divorce or arch enemies, you know. Sometimes you have therapists when the parents live close together, can go from one house to the other sometimes if they feel comfortable doing so. But the key to all of this is to try to the extent possible, within reason, to try to create an environment for the child where, even though the parents are separated and divorced, where there's as much consistency as possible between house one and house two in terms of schedules, in terms of what the expectations or demands may be, so that you're supporting the child's development as you would in an intact family. It's impossible to make everything exactly as it would be in an intact family when you're living in two separate homes, no matter how much people try, because you're in two separate homes. But you can at least make an attempt as a foundation for whatever the construction of the plan is going to be for the child moving forward, to try to get as close to that as possible. If you have parents who are fighting with each other because they can't agree on anything, which happens in a lot of divorces, one person says, I'm not listening to my ex is trying to tell me what to do. And the other parent says, well, he or she's not listening. You've never met anyone like my ex. They're the worst person ever, you know, completely uncooperative. And each side's perception is that the other side isn't the problem. And maybe that's true in some cases, and maybe sometimes both are the problem. Sometimes maybe neither is the problem. It's just the circumstances. But things such as, you know, improving to some degree, as impossible as some may think it may be, to improve the dynamic between the parties can go a long way in having a consistent program for the child, a child with autism. So, for example, they have what's known as co-parenting counseling. A lot of people don't know this even exists or what it is. Litigants don't. Some people think, I ask them sometimes, have you ever heard of co-parenting counseling? No, or they think it's marriage counseling, which it's not. Marriage counseling, you're trying to save a marriage or save a relationship. Co-parenting counseling is the exact opposite. The marriage is already over. You're divorced or divorcing or separated. That's done. But as co-parents, you still have to learn to work together better than you have in the past, perhaps, for the future in terms of the dynamic as joint partners, in a way, in working towards helping the child. So co-parenting counseling focuses on that. And it's not an evaluation. Nobody's undergoing a diagnosis. It is a form of counseling or therapy. It's confidential, just as mediation is, working on the ability of two separated or divorced parents to cooperate and communicate better than they have previously, because they're going to need to do that for the child. If you look at the custody statute in New Jersey, one of the first things listed there for a court to consider when you're considering joint custody is the willingness and ability of each parent to communicate and cooperate with the other party, rather than continue a dysfunctional war that doesn't really accomplish anything. Also, you'll find in these discussions, there could be issues concerning other family members and other concerns. Joni?
Yeah, well, I wanted to go back to the emotional response when you're talking about parenting time, because like Larry said, you have in an intact family, you might have somebody that's been taking more of an assertive role in taking care of the child, while the other person is providing for the finances. They're out there working. And now all of a sudden, one of the people have to give up the time that they were giving helping the child. And then the other one is like in a role where all of a sudden, oh, like, what is it that I do to now be in this role? So we see many times that there's disagreements in even like letting go. And so if we structure that parenting time, a lot of times we have a lot more success in those areas. Like, for example, as Larry said, like part of the training, if there's somebody that's already in the home, then they can be watching and observing. If they're in a school and there's an IEP, many parents don't understand that they can call an IEP meeting at any given time, and then they can go to the school district and they can say, we have a change in circumstances here, and can we have temporary some home therapy for parental training? So there's options like that. I usually recommend some type of written communication back and forth. This could be online, it could be through emails, it can be through text, or it could be a composition book, because that intensity and that consistency when we are retraining that brain become very important, because you see children on the spectrum that don't learn incidentally like neurotypically developing children do, and they don't really master a skill until they can show those skills in all areas. So they might show a skill in school and they might show in one home, but not particularly in another. So when you have that written communication, you know exactly what it is that you're working on. You can say what's working, what's not working, and then it kind of like takes away any misperceptions of to what somebody might have said, because it's there in writing. And then there's other important things, like for instance, children on the spectrum usually are not reinforced by social issues. So there's reinforcers or motivators that might be of their choosing. It shouldn't be anybody else's choosing, because what might be rewarding to me may not be for somebody else. And it could be something simple like a crazy straw. But everything can fall apart if you're working on a skill. For example, if somebody is working towards toilet training, and there is a particular motivator like such a book, that if you give that book on something that is less demanding, why would the child have to work so hard at toilet training to get it when they can work at something lesser and get it? So now you've just devalued that motivator. So in that communication book, you know, we might have to come into terms of agreement. Does somebody have to buy the same supplies? Or is that something that has to be given because it's only a one-of-a-kind thing? So people that are on special diets, there might be things such as gluten-free diets, and either those supplies have to be given during that visitation time, or there needs to be those special purchases. So all those things can go into a communication book where maybe somebody might feel a little bit better that there's a little bit more structure. And like Larry said, you know, we can change that negative thinking, because a lot of times people go to the what ifs, to the positive things like generalization. So they need to master it in different areas different situations to consider, a skill to be mastered. So you can focus on, hey, this gives an opportunity for the child to be with different people, different environments, a little bit different things, so they can start to generalize that skill. Some people don't know what to do with their downtime when they're letting go. And that's where a lot of the thoughts of those what ifs come. So all those things become very, very important. Now, like Larry said, sometimes there's extended families that are involved, and it all goes, are they being helpful or are they not being helpful? We already know that everybody has to be involved if we're retraining a brain around the clock, but if they're not going to be helpful in the divorce or the proceedings, that may not be specific timing for them to be so actively involved. And the creativeness that you can get to, like Larry was alluding to, when you're doing the structure of the parenting time, that it doesn't have to be all the children go at one time. It could be where all the children go this week, another week, it could be just the affected individual, or another time just the unaffected children. So maybe they can involve in some other enjoyable activities that they may not be able to involve, and you can get very creative with that.
Also, when you're trying to resolve settle a divorce situation, very often you find that one parent or the other is hesitant or resistant or sometimes scared to commit to something because what will be the impact of it? So for example, let's say you have one parent has been clearly the primary caretaker of the child with autism, or the child with special needs, and the other parent, has been out working or whatever, and they're coming home. Now they're living separately. So now the parent if they have to give up parenting time, one of the concerns is, well, I don't know what's going on over there, and what if they're not doing this, and what if they're not doing that, and what if the child regresses? And there's always a possibility of that happening in any case. In any case, no matter how well versed the parents are in autism, nobody can predict with a crystal ball what's going to happen. But sometimes you have cases where, because the person's belief that the other person is really not working in conjunction with what needs to be done, the fears are even greater. On the other hand, it may well be in many cases, at least in some cases, that a parent who has not really had the experience or need, perhaps in the past, as much of a need to step up to the plate because he or she was depending almost on the other parent to do nearly everything, rightfully or wrongfully, in terms of the division of labor. Now they have to do that. And sometimes they can, as long as they are trained and they learn and they are, open-minded to understanding what needs to be done. So as opposed to either side taking a risk, taking unnecessary long-term risk, you can do things in trial phases. Say, for example, okay, we're going to try this parenting schedule for a month. Let's see how it goes. It'll be so, for example, let's say mom was the primary caretaker in this hypothetical, and dad wants more time. Okay, so dad's going to have more time, but not just having more time to put the child in front of a TV set, in front of a computer, or to visit grandma. It's to be involved during that parent's time in the ongoing therapies and the trainings, and learning how to be not only a parent, but a parental therapist in a way, not a professional therapist, but a parental adjunct, so to speak, so that when the therapist is no longer around because school's out, or the home therapist, if there is one, has gone home, there can be ongoing reinforcement and generalization by each parent in the child's needs. To the extent that parent is willing to participate in that process, that extra time that the parent now has on this trial basis can actually be very helpful in the long run to the child in some cases, because now the child is getting the exposure to two parents, separate but still parents, in terms of the reinforcement of the skills in two different environments. So now the child is not locked into just one environment, and starting to generalize out in the community as well. That could happen. Now, there's a big difference between someone saying they're going to do it and actually following through and doing it. This is why you don't reach an agreement on what it's going to be for years in advance without testing things out first. You don't have to do that. You can try things out on a trial basis and then move forward from there. The other thing, as Joni had referenced, is when you have other children, it's very important sometimes not to lose track of the other children and their needs. You know, when I was on the bench, I interviewed a lot of children, a lot of teenagers, preteens, sometimes younger than that, depending on the circumstances. These interviews took place out of the parents' earshot. It was a closed courtroom. And while each child was unique and different, time and time again, I'd hear from siblings saying that they wanted some one-on-one time with their parent. And when they had a sibling with a disability, sometimes they loved the child, they loved their sister or brother, but they still wanted to feel that they were getting attention too. So it's not absolutely required in every divorce for whether it is a child with autism or not, for all the children to go as one package at the same exact time from one parent to the next. As Joni said, you can kind of try some other things out and give some one-on-one time and things of that nature. And also in some cases, you know, if you have well-meaning, involved other relatives, you know, grandparents, step-parents as the case may be, who also can be constructive members of the autism team, so to speak, that can actually be very helpful in the process. But they have to all be on the same page, really, for that to actually work and not become a basis for more conflict, which can actually derail a plan. I want to spend some time talking about some financial issues which take place in a divorce. Some common ones which come up are child support, alimony, and division of assets and debts, which is often called equitable distribution. That's what it's known as legally in New Jersey. Not every state has the same laws concerning that. Each state kind of has their own divorce laws. So I'm going to talk about New Jersey. So first of all, in a case involving a child with autism, let's come back to our hypothetical case involving a young child with autism. Okay, so if the child did not have autism, child support would be up to a court, or if there's an agreement reached by the parties, by agreement of the parties in mediation or otherwise. They have in New Jersey what are called the child support guidelines. You can Google them. You could go to NewJerseyCourts.gov, which is the judiciary's public website, and they have, I believe, the guidelines are. There's a link to the guidelines on there. And it's essentially a set of tables put together by some economists that are recognized by the courts as what the child support should be to raise a child in the state of New Jersey based upon the income or income potentials of each parent. That's essentially how it works. So these guidelines raise a rebuttable presumption as to what the support should be, or rebuttable presumption. What that means is that a judge can refer to it, but for good cause, they can deviate from it. So in other words, it's not automatic that the child support guideline number is going to be the number in child support. So there could be a basis, on a case-by-case basis, to adjust or deviate from the guidelines. But there has to be some basis to do it. You don't just do it because you feel like doing it at court. You have to have a basis to do it. So if you look in what's called Appendix 9A to the child support guidelines, they give you reasons why there could be a deviation from the guidelines. One happens to be if a child has special needs or a disability in some fashion. But this is the key point. The fact that you have a disability or a child has a disability is not what leads to more child support. It's what financial consequences there are from the disability, the extra costs and expenses, which may govern the situation and may justify a higher level of child support than there would be for a child without those expenses, you see. And so, for example, if you have a child with autism and there are all these extra out-of-pocket therapies and costs and accessories, whatever it may be, potentially there could be more child support because the theory is both parents should have to contribute to those costs, not just one. So the child support for a child with autism could be higher than child support for a child without autism in what is otherwise hypothetically the same situation. Parents of the same income, children of the same age, etc. If you take the same child who has autism, but he has no extra expenses, he or she has no extra expenses, everything's covered by the school district or by insurance or otherwise, then the basis to increase child support would not be there. Now, there are other expenses, unless there's some other facts which justify it. Now, keep in mind that the guidelines talk about base child support. There are other expenses that go beyond it. Uncovered medical expenses, for example, for a child, or dental expenses. Daycare expenses, or sometimes even summer camp expenses. If you have a child with autism who's going to a special summer camp in order to enhance his or her skills, that could be an expense above and beyond base child support, which both parents should cooperate in financially contributing to, or a court could order that. A court also has to look at the party's financial circumstance and ability to pay. You could have a child who would benefit from all kinds of additional financially based services. But if the parents are making minimum wage, or they're unemployed and they have barely enough money to pay their bills, it may not be feasible to pay for these things. On the other hand, if you have parents who have the financial ability to pay for a certain level of additional supplemental expenditures relating to the autism, then it's important to take a look at what the parents can afford to pay and what those expenditures are presently or in the reasonably foreseeable future. You don't just say, well, I'd like more child support, or I need more child support because I have a special needs child. You have to kind of tie it together to what the budget's going to be, at least anticipate it. Doesn't have to be to the penny, but something that reflects that, yes, these are the extra expenses you're going to have right now. Alimony is different from child support. Alimony is spousal support. Unlike child support, there are no alimony guidelines. There's no chart you could look at to cause any kind of conclusion or a rebuttable presumption as to what alimony should be. There's a general statute that governs spousal support. Spousal support is essentially within the discretion of a court. A court can award alimony, but doesn't have to. Very often in a settlement conference or in mediation, people agree to alimony because it's fairly likely there may be alimony in a case. For example, if hypothetically people have been married a long time, there's a massive income disparity between the parties, it could result in alimony, and there could be other reasons for alimony. I want this to be a, think that, well, it's either it is or is not alimony. It really depends on the facts of each case. But in a case involving a child with special needs, some factors that could justify an award of alimony if financial circumstances justify such a payment is, for example, if you have one parent who has left the workforce to care for the special needs child, to drive the child around to their therapies or whatnot, so they don't have the same opportunities for career advancement as perhaps the other spouse does, or as someone else might have if they did not have the extra responsibilities for a special needs child. There could be issues concerning respite, which means, let's say you have a parent who is doing all the work for the child, the other parent is never around or rarely around. So the caretaker doesn't really get a break. Let's say the other parent isn't even exercising parenting time. Then you're 24/7, you're parenting, and you can love your child to the highest levels possible. But everyone as a human being needs a break. That's why you have weekends and holidays and vacations. That's what those came about, to give people a break so you can recharge and be even a better parent for your child, focus. And there are other things you have to do in life besides care for a special needs child. As much attention as that child may need, there are other basic obligations in life, whether it's to other children or to yourself. So if the other parent is not cooperating or is not participating in, basically single parenting, that parent the caretaker may need extra funds to pay for respite to the extent it's not otherwise available through services. So alimony is a little different analysis than child support, but it can be an issue in these cases. Again, the fact that a parent has a special needs child doesn't automatically mean they're now entitled to any particular amount of alimony, but it is an issue that needs to be looked at. And then equitable distribution means how you divide assets and debts of the marriage. And I mentioned before, New Jersey is an equitable distribution state. There's no presumption that things get divided 50-50, but a lot of people in settlement conferences gravitate towards 50-50 because it sounds like the fairest thing to do. And sometimes, in some cases, it is. But for example, if let's say people are getting divorced and they didn't have any children, or they had all neurotypical children, and they're agreeing to sell their house, very often the house is the largest asset of the parties, and they're going to split the equity in the house 50-50 or whatnot. Well, that's fine in a lot of cases, and you could do that even in a case involving a child with autism. But keep in mind, when you do that, if you're selling the house and it's creating a situation where people are moving because the house is being sold, and if parents are moving out of district because they can no longer afford to stay in that district and they don't have the house anymore, that could have a ripple effect in certain ways concerning the child with autism. Number one, if the child is moving out of the school district that he or she is in, and there's already been a program in place that both parents feel is very strong and good and is helping the child, now the child is moving to some other school district, that other school district might not provide the same level of services as the first school district. So you have to kind of take a look at that. That's number one. They may not have the ability to do so. Number two, if the parents are moving far away from each other, if one's moving to Bergen County and the other's moving to Cape May, now you're talking about the co-parenting and the parenting schedules. It can be more difficult on the child, obviously. First of all, 50-50 time is going to be nearly impossible, even in those cases where the parties agree, unless you're going to have the child living on the Garden State Parkway going up and down for hours at a time to appease the parents, which, by the way, I've seen people agree to this. It was, you know, they have their child in the car for all this time because they had to have exact equal time with the child. You know, and so you got to be careful. And not to say you can't do that, you could do that, but you have to take a look at how this is going to actually play out. Logically, if you have two involved parents, it's helpful when they live close together, so they're both going to participate in these types of issues. The other thing is when you're trying to resolve some of these issues, financial issues, and many people can resolve them in a mediation, and those who can't, they take those to a court, and the court has to decide these issues. But a lot of times, sometimes you have parents who, for one reason or another, they're very persistent in their approaches, and they're not really that willing to bend in terms of what their starting point is. And Joni, I know you've spoken about this in other groups in terms of issues of cultural sensitivity and issues concerning parents who may be on the spectrum.
Yeah, and you know, this is a very, very emotional time. It's life-changing. So there's a lot of stress and anxiety that can ensue. And many times, because there is some research that will show that there is an association with genetics being linked to autism, that parents often might have some traits, and those traits can be misinterpreted, whether they're in a court or in the mediation setting. So it's important that if somebody is aware that those traits are present, that either their attorneys, if there's an attorney involved, or a mediator, that they become culturally competent, in these. So for example, if somebody doesn't have the ability to maintain eye contact, it doesn't mean that they're not telling the truth or eluding something. Or if they have perseverative thoughts, have difficulty transitioning, they may not be able to go from one topic to another. If their anxiety levels are going up and they're sitting there and they're like tapping a pencil, or their leg is going, they're just trying to help with that sensory input and not necessarily be disruptive. So becoming competent in those areas might be very helpful during the process. Also, with emotional responses, to take away personal questions, like maybe it might be more helpful, even if a parent answers, or if it's somebody who's facilitating the conversation, what do you want to happen as a parent? As a parent, what do you see the challenges are? As a parent, how do you see this happening? And visualize this. Now, if you're coming into where there is really heightened activity between the two caregivers, and they're getting very emotional, you can structure the conversation into one like, one of the things that you said was that you'd like your child to see that even after the divorce that you guys are getting along. How about, if we start practicing here and start using those effective communication skills to offer the structuring. But just very quickly, I just want to explain about when that stress and that anxiety goes up, what the response is, because we all have adrenal glands, and we're born with this protective mechanism. It's a survivor mechanism, and some people might know it as a fight or flight response. But when there's any type of a threat or a danger, which can easily be perceived when you're going through such a thing as a divorce, that heightened response can put you into an area of the brain where you become very, very impulsive. And there's no logic or problem-solving ability in this part of the brain, because you're responding to what you think is happening, not really what the facts are. We want to get into the side of the brain where you're not so impulsive or reactionary, that you can look at what the facts are, and that you can use the logic for the problem-solving skills. Now, the real thing of this is that, these hormone surges can last anywhere from 90 minutes to a couple of hours. So if whether you're in a court situation or in a mediation process, that might be a very, very good time to take a break to allow those hormone surges to go back down so that you can cross over where you need to be when you're trying to, work together collectively to have a mutual agreement.
I know we only have a couple of minutes left. I'm going to be taking some questions if there are any. I just want to make one final point on a growing area, a very good growing area, I should say, in the context of autism spectrum disorder and separation and divorce, which is more and more children, teenagers with autism spectrum disorder are starting to attend college, which is a great thing. I mean, 20, 30 years ago, you didn't see the same numbers that you do now. You see, and it's a reflection of the positive strides that have taken place with autism education, special education in school districts and otherwise, involved parents who help bring their children along from point A to point B to the point where they can go to potentially to college. And many universities are having programs now that are tailored to high functioning students with autism, etc. Now this becomes an issue sometimes in divorce proceedings in terms of, will the child go to college? Who's going to pay for the college? But it's very important, particularly if you have a child who looks like they're on the higher functioning end of things, to try to start that process in terms of readying the child for possible attendance at college as early as possible. You don't wait till senior year of high school. You start in terms of the parents cooperating with IEPs and things like that, that are structured on the long term to set the child up for the possibility of being able to apply for college, maybe as early as 7th or 8th grade, or even earlier than that. That requires a focus on academics as well as socialization, which is, of course, autism it involves social impairments for so many children. So as long as the parents, even though they're getting divorced, can get on the same page in conjunction with a behavioral therapist or other autism professionals, school district personnel on the child study team, to focus on this as a possibility rather than writing it off and say, oh, child has autism, they're never going to be able to be college eligible. You don't know that. There have been more and more and more success stories of children getting, maybe they're later, maybe they bloom later, maybe even if they've had some struggles, in academics or socialization, they hit their stride in high school. They'll always be autistic, perhaps. They'll always be on the spectrum because there's no cure. But more and more and more success stories have been coming about. So the fact that the parents are divorcing doesn't mean that the child should then fall through the cracks. There should be even more of an incentive of the parents to focus on a long-range plan that could be to the child's benefit. Okay, Andrew, can you hear us still, Andrew?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so I know we only have a few minutes left, but we'll stay as long as you want for any questions that anyone may have or comments.
Sure. Yeah. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to send them in the Q&A box or the chat box, and we'll be happy to answer them for you. While we're waiting, I guess a question is, are there ever issues concerning whether a child with autism who is over 18 should be emancipated?
Yes, that issue does in fact come up quite a bit, actually. And so what happens is, let's say you have a child, a teenager without autism, a typical teenager, let's say, and now they're over the age of 18, parents are divorced. It's fairly common for the non-custodial parent to seek to have that child emancipated, to terminate child support, essentially, and or to terminate any other obligations. So in New Jersey, and again, each state has different rules on this, but in New Jersey, after a child turns 18, the child could be emancipated, but it's not automatically emancipated. For example, if they're a full-time college student, emancipation may extend beyond the age of 18. Also, if a child is unable to be independently self-sustaining, self-sufficient, or functioning, so a child with a major disability, you could be unemancipated beyond 18, well into your adult years. So can that happen with a child with autism? With a child, of course it can. If a child has severe autism, and a child with severe autism and an adult with severe autism is less likely to be fully independent and fully functional. They will have abilities to do things, but they're going to have some challenges. Let's put it that way. And so the issue with emancipation is whether those challenges make the child, now the adult, able to be emancipated or not. The issue comes up quite frequently when you have a child turning adult who does not have severe autism, but perhaps is higher up on the spectrum. So it's kind of ambiguous as to whether that person can be independent or not. And so sometimes that's a very fact-sensitive issue. Sometimes you have a child who is able to go to college. I mentioned college before, but they're not going full-time. So if a parent's primary goal is to emancipate the child and child support, they may try to file an application with the court to say the child should be emancipated because why? Because they're not going to college on a full-time basis and they're able to be self-sufficient. And the issue coming back on the other side is usually something along the lines of, no, this child is not self-sufficient. Child is making progress. The child we're trying to set up for success. The child is becoming an adult. The adult cannot really go to school on a full-time basis, but is able to on a part-time basis. So please extend the time at the very least before there's emancipation. And in some cases, there's never an emancipation. So it's a very fact-sensitive issue, but it's not 18 and done. Now, as an adult, if you're collecting certain financial entitlements from the state or federal government, as the case may be, it could affect child support because there's funds coming in from other sources. And I just want to mention very briefly, it gets kind of complicated. I know we're running out of time, but there's something which is known as a special needs trust. And anyone who has a child with developmental disabilities, autism, or other disabilities, you really want to look into this because it's very important when you do estate planning and things like that. Because some people, they're very well-meaning. They want to leave life insurance either in a divorce or otherwise with their child as the beneficiary or other funds. But when you do that, you could potentially disqualify the child from other benefits that they might be entitled to that are substantial from the government. So they've set up this device known as a special needs trust, which can better allow parents who want to leave money or provide for their children to do so without potentially losing the same extent of benefits. And there are all kinds of special needs trusts, supplemental needs trusts. I would advise anyone who has a child with special needs to consult with an attorney who concentrates in that area and consider implementing that, whether there's a divorce or not. It's a wise thing to have for anyone in that situation, in my opinion.
Yeah. Andrew, I just wanted to add with the emancipation that when somebody's going to college, this is a whole nother level of social demands that are placed upon an individual. And I would not be privy to this information if I didn't work on a psychiatric unit. But the reality is that many people are coming in that are college bound, they're in college, and then all of a sudden they feel like they don't belong and they get very confused. And there's two variables that I have seen. One, that to try to fit in, that they start dabbling into, some risky business, like maybe some drug taking. And then we're finding that there's drugs that even marijuana that are laced with things that are inducing psychosis. And the other thing is that they come in suicidal. And that's the reality of it. So when somebody's quick to emancipate somebody because because they're going into college, that we need some time to see how that transition is going to occur, because there's a lot more serious issues that I'm seeing with college-bound individuals that are on the spectrum.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
No, I don't see any in the chat or the questions.
Well, I want to again thank Andrew, you and the New Jersey State Library and everyone who attended today for having us participate. And it's been a pleasure, and particularly because it's Autism Awareness Month, Autism Acceptance Month. And hopefully those who attended felt that it was beneficial and worthwhile. And we greatly appreciate the library's interest in the whole field of autism spectrum disorder. Joni?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for letting us be a part of this.
Yeah, thank you both for presenting. And again, thank you to our audience. You make our programming worthwhile. And we hope that everybody was able to take something away today. So be safe, be well, and hopefully we'll be able to see each other soon.
Okay. Take care, Andrew.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.